In the summer of 1945, in a converted luxury hotel in the small town of Bad Mondorf, Luxembourg, one of the strangest scenes in military history was unfolding. The building had been given a code name, Ashcan, and inside its walls, guarded by American military police with orders to prevent any escape or suicide attempts, sat the most powerful men who had ever commanded the armed forces of Nazi Germany, field marshals, generals, admirals, men who had once controlled millions of soldiers across 3 continents, men who had conquered France in 6 weeks and driven to the gates of Moscow, men who had ordered the destruction of cities and the deployment of weapons that killed tens of millions. Now they sat in plain rooms, wearing uniforms stripped of all insignia, eating simple meals, waiting for young American officers to call them in for questioning. Among them was General Feldmarschall Gerd von Rundstedt, the 70-year-old commander-in-chief of German forces in the West. He was a Prussian aristocrat who traced his military lineage back generations. He had orchestrated the invasion of Poland that started the war. He had accepted the surrender of France in that railway car at Compiègne. He had commanded the defense against the Allied invasion at Normandy and overseen the desperate Ardennes offensive that Americans would remember as the Battle of the Bulge. Now he sat across a wooden table from an American major, a 30-year-old officer from Columbia University named Kenneth Heckler, who had earned his doctorate in political science before being assigned to the Army's historical section. And the American wanted to know something very specific. He wanted to know what the Germans really thought about fighting the United States Army, what happened in that room, and in dozens of rooms like it over the following 16 years, would produce the largest debriefing of a defeated military in human history. Hundreds of former German officers would eventually participate. They would write over 2,500 manuscripts, totaling roughly 200,000 pages of analysis. Their assessments would be blunt, sometimes flattering, often critical, and occasionally devastating in their honesty. What they revealed about American soldiers, American tactics, and American commanders would shape how the United States military understood itself for generations. Some of their observations became legendary in military circles, and some of what they said still provokes debate among historians to this day. The program that made all of this possible had a deliberately bland bureaucratic name, the Foreign Military Studies Program. But there was nothing bland about what it represented. The United States Army had decided to turn its defeated enemies into consultants, to pay German generals, some of whom had commanded troops responsible for terrible atrocities on the Eastern Front, to write detailed analyses of their own campaigns, to sit with them for hours, sometimes days, and ask them to critique American performance in battle. The reasoning was coldly practical. The war in Europe had barely ended when American strategists began worrying about the next one. The Soviet Union, which had been an ally against Hitler, was rapidly emerging as a potential adversary. Soviet forces occupied Eastern Europe. Communist parties were gaining strength in France and Italy. The wartime alliance was fracturing along ideological lines that would soon harden into the Iron Curtain, and if war came with the Soviets, American commanders would need to understand how to fight in the same terrain where the Wehrmacht had fought. They would need to know the lessons the Germans had learned, often at terrible cost in blood, about armored warfare in the steppes of Russia, about defensive operations against overwhelming numbers, about fighting in the brutal conditions of the Eastern Front, where temperatures dropped to -40 degrees and entire divisions could be encircled and destroyed. So the army made a decision that would have seemed unthinkable just months earlier. They would ask the Germans to teach them. The man who came to dominate this program was himself one of the most senior officers in the former German military. Generaloberst Franz Halder had served as chief of the German General Staff from 1938 to 1942. This was the most powerful staff position in the German army. Halder had planned the invasions of Poland, France, Denmark, Norway, the Balkans, and the Soviet Union. He had been the architect of Operation Barbarossa, the attack on the Soviet Union that killed more people than any military campaign in history. After disagreements with Hitler over strategy on the Eastern Front, Halder was dismissed in September of 1942. He spent the final years of the war in retirement and was briefly imprisoned after the failed assassination attempt against Hitler in July of 1944. After Germany's surrender, he was held as a prisoner, but unlike many of his colleagues, he was never tried for war crimes. American interrogators found him cooperative and intelligent. By 1947, he had been released and recruited by the Americans to organize and direct the German officers who would contribute to the writing program. Halder ran the operation like a military command. He expected to be addressed by his former rank. He established a control group of trusted former officers who vetted every manuscript before submission to the Americans. His deputy in the post-war program was Adolf Husinger, who simultaneously worked for the Gehlen organization, the American-sponsored intelligence network in Germany that recruited former German officers to spy on the Soviets. The writing teams operated from camps established at Allendorf, Neustadt, and later Königstein in Germany. They produced studies organized into multiple series. The A series addressed Western Front operations, initially through oral interviews but quickly shifting to written questionnaires. The B series compiled unit narratives and operational histories. The C series, regarded by historians as the most reliable, was produced between 1948 and 1961 with access to captured German documents. The D series covered the Eastern Front, the Italian and Mediterranean theaters, along with Navy and Air Force operations. And the P series addressed organizational and administrative subjects. The Americans knew they were getting a filtered version of history. Halder instructed his writers to remove material that reflected poorly on the German military. The manuscripts consistently blamed Hitler for strategic failures, while portraying the professional officer corps as competent soldiers, simply following orders. They minimized or omitted entirely the German military's involvement in war crimes, mass executions, and the Holocaust. Modern historians have documented how the program contributed to what became known as the myth of the clean Wehrmacht. Wolfram Wetter examined these distortions in his book, The Wehrmacht, published in 2006. Ronald Smelser and Edward Davies explored similar themes in The Myth of the Eastern Front 2 years later. And James Wood published a scholarly analysis in the Journal of Military History that examined the program's compromised foundations. Together, their work revealed how the false narrative emerged, that the German army had fought honorably and professionally, while only Nazi Party organizations like the SS committed crimes. It was a myth that served the interests of both the German writers and their American sponsors. The Germans got rehabilitation. The Americans got allies. But the Americans tolerated this bias because they believed they needed the information. The Cold War was beginning. Soviet tank armies were positioned across Eastern Europe, and American commanders believed that German expertise in fighting the Russians was worth almost any price. What they got in return was a treasure trove of tactical and operational analysis. Detailed studies of every major campaign, assessments of Soviet fighting methods, technical analyses of German weapons and equipment. And embedded within those thousands of pages were candid assessments of American military performance that the German generals had experienced firsthand. The interrogations at Bad Mondorf had begun in the chaotic weeks immediately. Following Germany's unconditional surrender in May of 1945, Major Heckler, working under intense time pressure from Chief Historian Colonel S.L.A. Marshall, raced to extract testimony before war crimes trials began, and key witnesses became unavailable or uncooperative. He conducted what became known as the ETHINT series, an abbreviation for European Theatre Historical Interrogations. 80 sessions in all, with generals including Rundstedt, Guderian, Hodel, Keitel, Goering, and Manteuffel. The setting was deliberately stark. The Palace Hotel had been stripped of its luxury furnishings. The prisoners were held under close supervision. Some had attempted suicide in the early days of captivity. Guards checked on them constantly. The interrogation rooms were bare, with wooden tables and simple chairs. These were men who had wielded enormous power, men who had sent hundreds of thousands of soldiers to their deaths, men who had implemented strategies that reshaped the map of Europe. Now they sat in those bare rooms, answering questions from officers young enough to be their sons or even grandsons. Some prisoners were bitter and defensive. Some were broken, hollow-eyed men who had watched their world collapse. A few seemed almost relieved to finally be able to speak honestly about what had happened without fear of Hitler's retribution. And when they spoke about the American military, certain themes emerged again and again with remarkable consistency. General Feldmarschall von Rundstedt was the most senior German commander to be systematically debriefed about his experience fighting the Americans in Western Europe. As Commander-in-Chief West, he had overseen the German defense against the Normandy invasion and the subsequent fighting across France and into Germany itself. His testimony was later published in the United States Intelligence Bulletin in March of 1946, making it one of the first German assessments to reach a wide American audience. When asked what had defeated Germany in the West, Rundstedt did not hesitate or qualify his answer. "Three factors defeated us," he said. "First, the unheard-of superiority of your Air Force." He returned to this theme repeatedly throughout his interrogations. Air power was the decisive element. He elaborated on this judgment in devastating detail. Allied aircraft had made daytime movement of German forces nearly impossible by the summer of 1944. Railway junctions throughout France and Belgium were systematically destroyed, paralyzing the logistics system that German armies depended on for ammunition, fuel, and reinforcements. Roads became death traps where any vehicle, any column of marching troops, any concentration of armor could be spotted from the air and attacked within minutes. The carpet bombing that preceded major Allied offensives was not simply an intensified artillery barrage. It was annihilation from above. Rundstedt described how entire defensive positions would simply cease to exist after the bombers passed. The cratering made roads impassable. The concussion killed or incapacitated men, even in fortified positions. The psychological effect on troops who survived was often as devastating as the physical destruction. Rundstedt's assessment of American ground forces was more nuanced than his absolute condemnation of German helplessness against air power. He named George Patton and Bernard Montgomery as the two best Allied commanders he had faced in the West. But when pressed by his interrogators to choose between them, to identify which one had caused him more concern, he was unequivocal. Patton was a far more dangerous opponent. Montgomery was methodical, careful, and predictable. You could anticipate what he would do, because he followed established military doctrine with precision. He would not attack until he had overwhelming superiority. He would not take risks that might lead to defeat. This made him effective, but also made him easier to defend against. Patton was different. Patton was aggressive and fast, the kind of commander who kept German headquarters constantly off balance. You never knew where he would strike next or how far he would push an advantage. He embodied the kind of mobile warfare that German officers had once believed was their unique specialty. Rundstedt also assessed comparative Allied strengths in armor employment. Through his chief of staff Günther Blumentritt, who later conveyed these views to both American interrogators and British military historian Cornelius Ryan, Rundstedt indicated that American forces showed greater imagination and daring in the use of armor than the British. American tank units displayed a keen sense of mobile action, a willingness to improvise and exploit opportunities that arose on the battlefield. But it was Rundstedt's assessment of the broader strategic situation that carried the most weight with American listeners. He was brutally honest about the state of German defenses before the Allied invasion. The Atlantic Wall, the supposedly impregnable fortification system that Nazi propaganda had promoted so heavily, was in his telling a gigantic bluff. It was a propaganda wall, Rundstedt said. One has only to look at it for oneself in Normandy to see what rubbish it was. The propaganda photographs had shown impressive concrete bunkers and bristling gun positions. The reality was a thin line of incomplete fortifications manned by units of varying quality, many of them far below strength, lacking the reserves to counterattack if the line was breached. The Ardennes offensive, the desperate winter attack in December of 1944 that Americans would remember as the Battle of the Bulge, drew particular scorn from Rundstedt. He wanted it known clearly that the operation was a complete misnomer when it bore his name. "I strongly object to the fact that this stupid operation is sometimes called the Rundstedt offensive," he said. He had nothing to do with planning it. It came from Hitler, ordered from above down to the smallest detail. The forces allocated were far too weak for the objectives assigned. If Rundstedt provided the strategic perspective from the highest level of German command, other German officers offered more detailed tactical assessments based on their direct experience fighting American units. And one general in particular emerged as the most prolific and quotable analyst of American combat performance. Günther Blumentritt had served as Rundstedt's chief of staff during the Normandy campaign. This put him at the center of German operational planning in the West. He had direct experience fighting American forces. watching their attacks develop through intelligence reports, studying their methods as they unfolded on the battlefield, and coordinating the German tactical response. After the war, he became one of the most cooperative subjects for British military historian Basil Liddell Hart, whose book, The German General's Talk, would become a classic of military literature that shaped public understanding of the German perspective for decades. Blumentritt's assessment of American infantry under fire was considerably less flattering than his views on American armor. The Americans attacked with energy and enthusiasm when going forward, he told Liddell Hart. But when they came under heavy artillery fire, they often fell back. Even after they had made a successful penetration, even when they had achieved their initial objectives. The experience of being on the receiving end of concentrated fire would sometimes cause them to withdraw and give up ground, rather than dig in and consolidate their gains. This was in stark contrast to British infantry in Blumentritt's experience. Once the British had established themselves in a position and had been there for 24 hours, it proved almost impossible to shift them. The British would dig in and hold ground, with a stubborn determination that American units in his experience sometimes lacked. They would take casualties and hold. They would be counterattacked and hold. Something in their training or their national character made them excel at the defensive fight. German soldiers who had served on both the Eastern and Western fronts often remarked on the difference. The fighting in the East was a brutal close-quarters struggle, where infantry skill and determination decided battles. Fighting the Americans was primarily about enduring their overwhelming firepower and waiting for the next bombardment to end. When the subject turned to individual American commanders, Blumentritt's most detailed and dramatic assessment concerned George Patton, in a post-war study prepared directly for the United States Army itself, knowing it would be read by American officers. Blumentritt stated that the Germans regarded Patton extremely highly as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies. He was a man of incredible initiative and lightning-like action. His operations impressed German commanders enormously, probably because he came closest to their own concept of the classical military commander. Blumentritt went further in his praise. Patton embodied the principle that movement and aggression could compensate for other tactical shortcomings. He understood that in mobile warfare, the side that moved faster and struck harder usually won regardless of numerical disadvantages. When comparing Patton directly to Montgomery, Blumentritt became almost theatrical in a way that Liddell Hart recorded with evident amusement. After praising Patton's speed and aggression, Blumentritt noted that Montgomery was the one general who never suffered a reverse. He never lost a battle. But then Blumentritt stood up from his chair and demonstrated the difference physically. Montgomery moved like this, he said, and took a series of very deliberate, very heavy steps across the room. Each footfall was careful, measured, and slow. The point was unmistakable. Montgomery was methodical to the point of being ponderous. He was effective, certainly. He achieved his objectives. But he was not the kind of commander who kept German officers awake at night wondering where the next blow would fall. But it was in the records of actual combat that German assessments became most vivid and emotionally powerful. And no single testimony captured the experience of facing American military power more dramatically than the account given by General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, commander of the elite Panzer Lehr Division. The Panzer Lehr was one of the finest armoured formations in the German military. Lehr means demonstration or instruction. The division had been formed from training units, staffed by experienced instructors and equipped with the latest weapons. Its personnel were veterans, selected for their expertise. When it deployed to Normandy in June of 1944, it represented the best that Germany could field. On July 25, 1944, American forces launched Operation Cobra, the long-awaited breakout from the Normandy beachhead. The operation began with one of the largest tactical airstrikes of the entire war. Nearly 3,000 aircraft, heavy bombers, medium bombers, and fighter bombers dropped more than 4,000 tons of bombs on a narrow rectangle of French countryside west of Saint-Lô. The target area was approximately 7 kilometers wide and just over 2 kilometers deep, and Bayerlein's Panzer Lehr Division was directly in the impact zone. His description of what happened that morning remains one of the most powerful and harrowing accounts of combat in the Second World War. The planes kept coming overhead like a conveyor belt, Bayerlein recalled, and the bomb carpets came down, one after another. My front lines looked like a landscape of the moon, and at least 70% of my personnel were out of action. Dead, wounded, crazed, or dazed. He continued the description in terms that convey the totality of destruction. Back and forth, the bomb carpets were laid across our positions. Artillery emplacements were wiped out completely. Tanks were overturned and buried by debris and cratering. Infantry positions were flattened. All roads and tracks in the area were destroyed beyond use. By midday, the entire area resembled a moon landscape, with the bomb craters touching rim to rim as far as you could see. All signal communications had been cut, and no organized command was possible. Several of my men went mad from the concussion and the terror, and rushed around in the open until they were cut down by bomb splinters. When a staff officer from Field Marshal Gunther von Kluge's headquarters reached Bayerlein on July 26 and demanded that he hold the line at all costs, insisting that not a single man should leave his position. Bayerlein's response became legendary in German military circles. It was the voice of a commander who had just watched his divisions cease to exist as a fighting force. "Out in front, everyone is holding out," he said. "Everyone. My grenadiers and my engineers and my tank crews. They are all holding their ground. Not a single man is leaving his post. They are lying silent in their foxholes, for they are dead. Only the dead can now hold the line. The Panzer Lehr Division is annihilated." This was the reality of facing American military power at its most concentrated. The Panzer Lehr had been one of the finest armored formations in the world. Its personnel were experienced, professional, and well-equipped, and it had been functionally destroyed in a single morning by aircraft alone, before American ground forces had even begun their advance. The other element of American combat power that earned genuine and consistent German fear was artillery. And here the assessments were virtually unanimous across all sources and all ranks of German military experience. The United States Army had perfected a firing technique to a degree that no other military in the world had achieved. It was called time on target. The British had developed the basic concept in North Africa in 1941 and 42, using synchronized timing to coordinate multiple batteries. But the Americans took the technique far further, creating pre-computed firing data that automated the complex calculations and made simultaneous bombardment practical at enormous scale. The principle was deceptively simple in concept, but extraordinarily difficult in execution. Multiple artillery batteries, sometimes an entire corps worth of guns spread across many kilometers of front, would coordinate their fire so that all shells arrived at exactly the same location at exactly the same moment. This required precise calculations of distance, trajectory, weather conditions, and timing for each individual battery. Different guns at different distances had to fire at different times so that their shells, traveling at different speeds over different distances, would all converge on the target simultaneously. When it worked, and by the later stages of the war, American artillerymen had made it work with devastating reliability, the effect was catastrophic. German soldiers who survived time-on-target barrages described them in terms that bordered on the supernatural. There was no warning, no sound of approaching shells before the first rounds hit, no opportunity to hear the whistle of incoming fire and dive for cover, just sudden simultaneous annihilation across an entire position. Dozens or even hundreds of shells arriving in the same second, with no chance for human reaction. An American Corps artillery, coordinating all its batteries, could theoretically mass fire on a single grid reference within 9 minutes of receiving the fire mission. This responsiveness was unmatched by any other army in the war. At Dom-Butgenbach, during the Battle of the Bulge in December of 1944, American artillery fired over 10,000 rounds, enabling the 1st Infantry Division to hold its positions against determined German panzer attacks. More than 200 divisional and corps artillery pieces concentrated their fire on attacking German formations. At the Rhine crossing in March of 1945, over 2,000 American guns delivered devastating preparatory bombardments as part of an Allied force totaling more than 5,000 artillery pieces. German soldiers learned to fear even the smallest American aircraft. The Piper Cub L-4 observation plane, a tiny fabric-covered aircraft that looked almost toy-like in comparison to fighters and bombers, became an object of particular dread among German troops. Post-war interrogations consistently revealed that experienced German soldiers understood immediately what the presence of one of these small planes meant. Their position had been spotted. Their location was being reported by radio, and it would be only a matter of minutes before a rain of steel would come down on their heads. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, writing from the front lines in Italy, reported what captured German prisoners told their American interrogators. "Our artillery," they said. "The Germans feared it almost more than anything we had, more than our tanks, more than our infantry. The artillery was death that came from beyond the horizon, that could not be fought, that could only be endured." But German assessments of American forces were not simply a catalogue of praise for firepower and industrial might. Many German officers, particularly those who had commanded at divisional and corps level, offered pointed and specific criticisms of American ground tactics. And these criticisms were remarkably consistent across different sources and different campaigns. General der Panzertruppe Hermann Balck had commanded Army Group G against Patton's Third Army in the Lorraine Campaign of Autumn, 1944. He was described by his colleague Friedrich von Mellenthin, who served as his chief of staff, as having strong claims to be regarded as Germany's finest field commander. In 1979, more than 3 decades after the war ended, Balck participated in recorded interviews conducted by the Battelle Columbus Laboratories for the United States Army. His assessment of American tactical leadership was blunt and cutting. He criticized what he called the American practice of hire commanders to halt their units at night. American formations would advance during daylight hours, then stop, establish defensive positions, and wait for morning before continuing. This allowed German defenders time to reorganize, bring up reinforcements, establish new positions, and prepare defenses. It forced American troops to break through a new defensive line every morning at a considerable cost in casualties. German units, by contrast, continued operations around the clock whenever possible, maintaining pressure that prevented defenders from ever settling into positions. Balck's famous axiom was that night marches save blood. Balck and Mellenthin, reviewing the Lorraine campaign at their headquarters during the fighting, would stand before their maps and observe that Patton was helping them. He failed to exploit another success. The aggressive reputation that Patton enjoyed after the war was not, in Balck's telling, matched by consistent exploitation of tactical opportunities during the actual fighting. Again and again, American forces would achieve a breakthrough and then fail to push through before German reserves could seal the gap. Other German commanders at various levels echoed this assessment with similar specific criticisms. Waffen-SS Gruppenführer Max Simon offered a summary that captured the broader German view of American tactical philosophy. "The tactics of the Americans," he said, "were based on the idea of breaking down a wall by taking out one brick at a time. Methodical, systematic, safe, but slow and wasteful of opportunities." Simon added a pointed comparison based on his Eastern Front experience. "Had you made such attacks on the Eastern Front," he said, "where our anti-tank guns were echeloned in depth rather than concentrated forward, all your tanks would have been destroyed before they reached their objectives." Major General Eberhard Roth of the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division prepared a post-war assessment describing how American forces conducted their operations in Sicily. He noted that American forces attacked only after heavy artillery preparation, when they believed they had completely broken the resistance of German defenders. In his assessment, American movements were systematic, and attacks came only when fire support was ready, giving the Germans time to recover, even when their positions were close to collapse. The consistent German criticisms across all these sources were specific and technical. They identified patterns that appeared repeatedly in American operations: road-bound movement that failed to exploit cross-country mobility, over-reliance on firepower rather than maneuver and speed, reluctance to continue operations at night when German defenses were weakest, predictable approaches that allowed defenders to anticipate where attacks would come, failure to exploit breakthroughs aggressively before defenders could reorganize and seal gaps. What made these criticisms sting particularly was that some American commanders privately agreed with them. Patton himself recorded in his diary during the Battle of the Bulge that the Germans are colder and hungrier than we are, but they fight better. This was not false modesty from one of history's most self-confident generals. It was an honest assessment that German infantry, man for man, often outperformed their American counterparts in close combat. But these criticisms, however valid they may have been in narrow tactical terms, perhaps missed a larger and more important point: The American system was arguably deliberate rather than accidental. American commanders had made a conscious strategic choice to trade infantry aggressiveness for overwhelming firepower. The goal was to minimize American casualties, not to match German tactical brilliance in close combat. And the results of that choice spoke for themselves in the final accounting. Germany lost the war. The Wehrmacht, for all its tactical skill and professional excellence, was ground to dust between American industrial power in the West and Soviet manpower in the East. The brilliant maneuvering that German officers prided themselves on had not prevented the total destruction of their armed forces and the unconditional surrender of their nation. Yet the question of whether German assessments of American commanders were entirely honest remains controversial among historians. Harry Yade, an American military historian, conducted a detailed examination of actual wartime German intelligence records for his book Fighting Patton, published in 2011. What he found challenged the post-war mythology significantly. The Germans, Yade discovered by examining their own documents, did not track Patton's movements as the key to Allied intentions during the actual fighting. They never raised his name in intelligence assessments in the context of worthy strategists to be particularly feared. The first German mention of Patton in intelligence records was a brief mid-May 1943 report simply noting he had taken command of 2nd Corps in North Africa, a position he had actually already left by that time. It was hardly the fearful attention that post-war accounts would suggest. The glowing assessments of Patton that became famous in military circles all came after the war was over. Guderian stated that from the standpoint of a tank specialist, he must congratulate Patton for his victory, since he acted as Guderian himself should have done had he been in Patton's place. Jodl told American interrogators that Patton was the American Guderian, very bold, who preferred large movements. Blumentritt described him as the most aggressive panzer general of the Allies. These assessments came during the period when German generals were being debriefed by American officers who had obvious professional and personal incentive to hear praise of their own commanders. During the actual fighting, German assessments were more measured and sometimes dismissive. Roth's post-war report described Patton's 7th Army operations in Sicily as systematic and methodical rather than bold or unpredictable. Balk found Patton's Lorraine campaign disappointing and poorly executed. The post-war upgrading of Patton's reputation among German officers coincided with Germany's integration into NATO and the pressing need for former Wehrmacht officers to build positive relationships with their new American partners. This does not mean the praise was entirely fabricated or insincere. Patton genuinely was the Allied commander closest to traditional German operational philosophy. His emphasis on speed and movement, his willingness to take risks, his instinct for exploitation rather than consolidation, these were qualities that German officers trained in their professional tradition recognized and genuinely respected. But the most dramatic and quotable praise emerged in a context of mutual benefit rather than pure disinterested. Professional admiration. German generals had powerful incentives to flatter their American audience, and American interviewers had their own professional and institutional reasons to accept flattering assessments of American military performance. The program that produced all of these assessments continued for 16 years, finally concluding in 1961. By that time, the world had changed dramatically from the chaos of 1945. The Cold War was at its height. Germany had been formally divided into the Democratic West and Communist East. The former enemies had become close allies within the NATO alliance. And Franz Halder, the man who had organized and directed the German officers who contributed to the writing program, received a remarkable honor from the nation he had once fought against. In 1961, he was awarded the United States Meritorious Civilian Service Award. He became the only German officer in history to be formally decorated by both Adolf Hitler and an American president. The manuscripts produced by the Foreign Military Studies program remained classified or restricted for decades. After the program ended, they were used extensively to train American officers preparing for potential war with the Soviet Union. They influenced American tactical doctrine throughout the Cold War, and they shaped how generations of military historians and the general public understood the German military experience in the Second World War. But as historians and scholars gained fuller access to these documents and were able to compare them systematically to other primary sources from both sides, the limitations and biases became increasingly clear. The program had produced invaluable tactical and operational information that could not have been obtained any other way. But it had also produced systematic distortions carefully designed to protect the professional and personal reputations of the officers who wrote them. The myth of the clean Wehrmacht, the false and historically indefensible narrative that the German army had fought a conventional professional war while only Nazi party organizations committed atrocities, drew heavily on these manuscripts. Halder and his colleagues had deliberately instructed writers to exclude material that documented military involvement in mass executions, deportations, and the Holocaust. They had blamed Hitler personally for every strategic failure, while crediting the professional officer corps for every success, however temporary. Modern historians have documented these distortions in exhaustive detail. The German military history program, James Wood wrote in a scholarly assessment published in the Journal of Military History, created a captive audience for captive historians. The Americans got tactical expertise they desperately wanted. The Germans got professional rehabilitation they desperately needed. It was an exchange that served both parties, while obscuring important truths. The original manuscripts are now held at the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, and the United States Army Heritage and Education Center at Carlisle Barracks, Pennsylvania. Researchers and historians can examine them directly and judge for themselves how much weight to give assessments that were produced under such compromised and self-interested circumstances. What remains undeniable despite all? These qualifications is the power of these testimonies to illuminate what American soldiers actually faced in combat against German forces. The fear that American artillery and air power inspired in German troops was genuine and documented from multiple independent sources. The frustration that German commanders felt as their forces were methodically ground down by overwhelming material superiority was real and deeply felt. The respect that officers like Blumentritt and Rundstedt expressed for American logistics, for the ability to move millions of men and millions of tons of supplies across an ocean and project unprecedented power onto a hostile shore, was not manufactured for American consumption. The assessments also illuminate what American forces genuinely lacked compared to their German opponents. The criticisms of American reluctance to conduct night operations, of predictable and methodical tactics, of consistent failure to exploit success aggressively, these were observations that American military reformers took seriously in the decades that followed. The army that fought in Vietnam, and later in the Persian Gulf and Iraq and Afghanistan, incorporated lessons that traced back directly to these German critiques. In the end, the German generals' assessments tell a story far more nuanced and complex than simple praise or simple criticism. They reveal a professional military establishment that was genuinely shocked by American industrial and logistical power, genuinely terrified of American artillery capabilities and air superiority, but also genuinely contemptuous of what they perceived as methodical, unimaginative, overly cautious ground tactics. The most honest reading of these sources suggests that American commanders won the war in the West, not by matching German tactical brilliance on the battlefield, but by making traditional tactical brilliance strategically irrelevant. They buried it under a weight of steel and explosives and aviation fuel that no amount of operational artistry could overcome. Rundstedt's emphasis on air superiority and Simon's dismissive observation about taking out one brick at a time were really two sides of the same fundamental coin. The Americans had found a way of war that did not require them to be better soldiers in the traditional close combat sense. And the German generals, heirs to a proud military tradition stretching back centuries, never entirely forgave them for it. That tension between respect and resentment, between genuine professional admiration and wounded professional pride, runs through every page of these documents. The German generals praised American firepower because they had no choice. They had experienced its effects firsthand. They had watched their finest divisions disintegrate under bombing raids and artillery barrages that no amount of tactical skill could counter. But they could not quite bring themselves to fully admit that firepower was a form of generalship, that logistics was itself a form of strategy, that the American way of war, however inelegant and unsubtle it might appear to officers trained in the classical European tradition of Frederick the Great and Helmuth von Moltke, had proven devastatingly and undeniably effective. The soldiers on both sides who served under these generals paid the ultimate price for that effectiveness. Hundreds of thousands of German troops died in Western Europe, many of them killed by artillery bombardments and air attacks they could neither predict, nor prevent, nor escape. The Panzer Lehr Division that Bayerlein described as annihilated at Saint-Lô was only one of dozens of German formations that were effectively destroyed by concentrated American firepower before ground combat even began. And the American soldiers who delivered that firepower were themselves transformed forever by the experience. They learned that modern industrial war was fundamentally different from the conflicts of previous generations. Victory would go to the side that could produce more weapons, transport more supplies, and deliver more destruction. The armies that their grandfathers and great-grandfathers had known, armies where individual courage and tactical skill by small units might decide the outcome of a battle, had been replaced by something new and unprecedented in human history. This was something that the German generals, for all their professional expertise and operational experience, had never quite understood until it was already too late to matter. Today, more than 80 years after those interrogations at Bad Mondorf, the records of the Foreign Military Studies program remain available to anyone who wishes to examine them. The interrogation transcripts, the manuscripts, the tactical assessments and operational analyses, all of it forms part of the permanent historical record of the Second World War. And embedded within those documents are the voices of men who fought on the losing side of history's largest conflict. Men who had once sincerely believed themselves the finest professional soldiers in the world. Men who had conquered most of Europe and threatened to conquer more. Men who eventually sat in bare rooms in Luxembourg and Germany and tried to explain to their American conquerors exactly what had gone wrong with their plans for victory. Their answers were self-serving in many obvious ways. They blamed Hitler for every major strategic error while taking credit for any tactical successes. They blamed the weather and the terrain. They blamed impossible shortages of fuel and ammunition. They minimized or ignored their own professional misjudgments and exaggerated their personal achievements. But when they spoke specifically about American military power, something different emerged through the self-justification, a grudging and sometimes awed recognition that they had faced something genuinely unprecedented in the history of warfare. An industrial democracy that could mobilize its entire continental economy for total war. A military establishment that could absorb terrible casualties and replacement losses and keep coming forward without pause. An air force that could darken the sky over any battlefield it chose to contest. An artillery arm that could deliver mathematical annihilation on any coordinate within minutes of receiving the request. The German generals had believed, with deep professional conviction, that superior tactical skill and warrior spirit could overcome material disadvantage. This had been the central premise of German military thinking for generations, and in the end, they had been proved catastrophically wrong. Field Marshal von Rundstedt, the aristocratic Prussian who had commanded millions of men across multiple campaigns and multiple years, sat in a bare room and admitted to a young American officer that air power had destroyed everything his forces attempted. Fritz Bayerlein, commander of one of Germany's elite armoured divisions, described his men lying dead in their foxholes, killed before the ground battle even began. Günther Blumentritt, trying to explain to Liddell Hart why Montgomery had succeeded where others might have failed, stood up and demonstrated the British general's cautious, heavy tread across a floor. These were the moments when the professional mask slipped, when pride gave way to honest assessment, when defeated generals acknowledged without reservation what their American and British conquerors had actually achieved against them. The program that systematically recorded these testimonies was deeply imperfect. It was compromised throughout by bias and obvious self-interest. It produced comfortable myths alongside genuine insights. It whitewashed crimes alongside documenting tactics. But it also preserved voices that would otherwise have been lost to history forever. The voices of professional military men who knew from direct personal experience what it meant to face American military power and somehow survive to describe it. Their testimony stands as a permanent reminder of what that generation of Americans accomplished. The soldiers who landed under fire at Normandy and fought their way across France and into Germany itself. The airmen who flew thousands of bombing missions over German positions, knowing that anti-aircraft fire and fighters waited for them. The artillerymen who perfected the techniques of massed coordinated fire that turned distant battlefields into landscapes of craters. the logisticians and quartermasters who kept all of it supplied and moving forward day after day. Those American soldiers were not perfect by the exacting standards of German professional military education. They relied heavily on firepower. They were reluctant to fight at night. They did not always exploit their tactical successes as aggressively as they might have, but they won. Completely and unconditionally. And that, stripped of all professional hedging and diplomatic qualification, was what the German generals really told American officers about fighting the United States Army.